I've got a choice to make. Do I stick with my old way of life, or embrace this exciting new culture? What can the Romans do for me? I'm an accidental time traveller from the 21st century who was living in Iron Age Britain. I'd even made a new life for myself as a potter in a small Cornovii tribe settlement, when it happened again. I fell asleep and woke up 600 years later in a now much changed and conquered land. This time I've woken up in 130 AD, Roman Britain. Assuming I'm still in the same place that I fell asleep 600 years ago, a small farming settlement in what is now Staffordshire in the Midlands of England. At first glance, things are looking actually quite familiar. A lot of sights, sounds and smells are very much the same. I can still see roundhouses, even if a few more of them have popped up. Agriculture still seems to be the dominant way of life. Most of the animals seem to be the same. And there's actually not much to indicate just how far forward in time that I've travelled yet. If I look around though, what's the biggest change I'm likely to notice? The community I'd settled into was on the edge of a woodland, and now as I look around, a lot of that woodland is completely gone. A lot of it had already been cleared by 500 BC to make room for this farmland, but now that farmland has considerably expanded and a lot more of the woods have gone. After all, a lot's happened in 600 years. I don't know it yet, but also our new hosts, the Romans, needed a lot of timber for their construction projects locally, so they took a fair few of the trees down as well. So within our community things still seem somewhat familiar. What if we venture outside? Well, not too far away, probably within walking distance, there are going to be some new things to see. There's going to be stone paved roads. In fact, I might come across more than one. And the incredible thing is that this is a road that I would have literally driven down in the 21st century. One of them is King Street, which still runs through Fenton in Stoke-on-Trent, and still loosely follows the path of the old Roman road. If I followed this street, we'd come across another paved road, what was later known as Reichenald Street, and we'll eventually come across some locations we didn't recognise from 500 BC, but places that I might recognise from the 21st century. Places like Chesterton, Holditch, and Trent Vale. These names are familiar to me from modern times. In fact, in modern times, Holditch is still very much an industrial area, just as it was back then. There's way more activity now. More permanent structures, more buildings along the side of the road, more vehicles moving around. I can't see any grand towns nearby, but certainly evidence of large-scale Roman buildings, the foundations of which I may have seen in the modern day at the Apedale Museum. But no, round here I can't see any grand settlements. They're going to be a bit further afield if I keep following the road, either towards Chester, which the Romans called Diva, or headed south towards Watling Street, where I'd come across places like Latositum, or the regional capital of Viraconium. If you want to learn more about where I've come from, and my life in 500 BC, then I recommend you check out episode 1 of this series. The link will be on your screen and in the description if you'd like to catch up. Now, one feature of the landscape that we saw back in 500 BC were hill forts, places like Castle Ring and the Wrekin. All of those places that had massive defensive earthworks and settlements. Well, if we went there now, they're not going to be so impressive anymore. In fact, a lot of them are just gone, or at least the impressive bits are, and they've largely been abandoned. They're probably going to be very overgrown, with much of their defences removed. You see, these hill forts proved not so formidable up against the Roman armies, so by this time they'd kind of served their purpose and were no longer used, with much of the population moving into more Romanised settlements. Of course the Romans discouraged their use as well. They may have taken them easily enough, but they didn't really want to have to do the whole thing again, so they weren't taking any chances. So my first instinct is to look for some familiar faces, people who can tell us about this strange new time we found ourselves in. Who are we likely to find around here? Well, a lot of the locals are still going to be of Cornovii stock. That's the Celtic tribe that lives around here, and that we integrated into 600 years ago, although at the time they weren't known as the Cornovii, because that's a Roman name. By now, they'll start answering to that name. They're still speaking a familiar language to us. We'd learnt some common Brittonic during our time in 500 BC, and by now we understand it reasonably well, so we're going to be able to communicate with any locals we run into. Although it might sound odd, because the language might have been flavoured by a bit of Latin by now as well. As we get closer to the Roman roads, we've got a good chance of running into some genuine Romans, or at least people of Roman stock who have been settled here a while, maybe even for a few generations by now. And of course they're going to be speaking Latin, and I don't speak Latin, so I'm going to struggle with them. Although by now they might understand some common Brittonic as well if I tried that. So the conversation might be a bit awkward, but it might be possible. Here's an interesting thought. I'm still wearing the same clothes that I fell asleep in 500 BC. Are people in this time going to think I look really odd? In general, probably not, if I'm honest. The locals would likely still be dressed more or less the same way. They'd still be wearing woolen-based clothes, leather boots, probably a tunic and a cloak in the same style. A lot of the common folk won't have gone full Roman by now and adopted the latest Roman fashions. Maybe some people in higher society have, but for the locals they pretty much carried on as they were. Old habits die hard after all. The pin on our cloak might actually raise a few eyebrows. It would probably look quite old-fashioned by now. So what if I run into some actual Roman soldiers? Well, to be honest, I'd be far more surprised to see them than they would be to see me. The Romans have been here nearly a century by this point, so if I'm stood there staring at them with a confused look on my face, they're probably going to wonder what's wrong with me. As I said, if I tried speaking to them, they might understand my broken common Brittonic, they might even speak some themselves. But some linguists believe that around this time, a sort of Brittonic vulgar Latin had developed, which was sort of a blend between the two languages, though the extent of this is disputed. Of course there's also a chance that these soldiers might even be native Britons who'd joined up as auxiliaries. In that case, they'd probably understand me just fine. Would they give me any trouble? Hopefully not, as long as I'm not doing anything suspicious, if you don't count standing there gawping at them. By this time the Romans and the locals were coexisting quite peacefully. They might just ask me to move along and not give me much time of day, but I'm not in any danger. I wouldn't expect a totally warm welcome though. If I manage to get near some more Romanised institutions or settlements, tavernas, houses etc., I'm not a Roman citizen, so they're probably not going to welcome me with open arms. The coexistence was peaceful, but it wasn't exactly a fully integrated society. It was a bit more formal than that, more like a governing and governed relationship. I could go into a Roman taverna or a Roman institution for a drink or some food, but it might be a bit like walking into that dodgy local pub where everyone knows each other and you feel a bit conspicuous, as an outsider. So after all this time travelling, I'm proper clemmed, and I need some snapping, so I'm going to head back to my community, where I'll hopefully be a bit more welcome, and have a bite to eat. Has anything changed on the menu since 500 BC? In 500 BC my diet was pretty basic. It was mainly grain-based, things like porridges and potages, forage, some basic dairy, but nothing particularly fancy. This time amongst this local community, I'm probably not going to find anything dramatically different. The food's still going to be seasonable, it's probably still going to be based on what we can grow locally. It's going to be accompanied by wild vegetables that might have been cultivated by now, but are still produced locally. One thing they do have access to now are Roman markets, so we might find things that have been imported, such as onions and garlic and things like that. We might notice that Roman things have started to influence the way we eat. We might be eating off plates, with cutlery, and maybe ceramic bowls, fancy stuff like that. If I didn't fancy this, I might be able to pop to a Roman market and pick up some imported goods that I didn't have access to before, that I miss from the 21st century. I might find wine, olive oil, and exotic stuff like that, maybe some spices. But here's a catch, and it's quite a big one. I'd need money. And of course I don't have any of that from 500 BC, it simply didn't exist back then. Coinage is now in use in Stoke-on-Trent. I mean, as in Roman Stoke-on-Trent. Of course it's in use in modern Stoke-on-Trent, even if most of us don't have much of it. Anyway, we've got archaeological evidence of this in abundance. Things like the Lightwood Hoard, that I covered previously in the Potteries Then and Now series. Feel free to watch that via the playlist in the description if you're interested. So unless I've got coins in my pocket, which I'm not gonna have, I'm probably stuck with trade with the locals, using goods just like we would have done 600 years ago. The locals still didn't tend to use money amongst themselves, they tended to save that for the Romans. As I mentioned, old habits die hard, and it just wasn't necessary between themselves, when you could just trade tit for tat. so to get hold of some coins I'd probably have to do some trade and try and get hold of a few. Now hypothetically, if I managed to befriend some Romans, what if they fancied taking me out for a meal? Well, that's going to be a bit of a different experience. I might be treated to a sit-down meal with multiple courses. We'd be using plates, cutlery, we'd have goblets of wine, perhaps even dishes with fish and meat and sauces, depending on the level of society that we entered into. All sorts of things that I would be familiar with from the 21st century, but I didn't see in 500 BC. To be fair, if I'd managed to get close to a wealthy Cornovii tribe or chief by now, their dining experience probably wouldn't be too different from the Romans. They'd probably adopted a lot more of the Roman practices by now. The upper classes tended to adopt these things a lot more than the lower classes, so there's a good chance they'd become quite Romanised. So far so good. I quite like it here. Previous experience tells me that I just can't control this time travel thing, so there's a good chance I'm going to be stuck here for a while, and I might as well make the best of it. What kind of life can I expect to have here? Well, as I mentioned at the start, we do have a choice now. Do I stick with my native Cornovii community, or do I go full Roman and embrace this new way of life? So if I stuck with my native community, life would still go on, and probably still be quite hard work. We're going to have to do a lot of farming, a lot of what we make is going to be made locally and traded for, and of course there's still the same dangers that there were from famine or disease, just like 600 years ago. My life would be fairly routine probably. I'd be making tools, the day-to-day grind, farming, and my world would probably still feel quite small. I'd live most of my time locally, maybe with the occasional glimpse of Roman culture, and quite probably a few more rules and taxes and that sort of thing that weren't there in 500 BC. If I decided to continue as a potter, just like I was in 500 BC, I would have access to some new technology by now. I would have access to, for example, a pedal-driven wheel, inspired by the Romans. I would also have better kiln technology, so I'd probably be able to produce more. The Roman kilns were far superior to those that I would have had in 500 BC. There is some good news. I'd be pretty safe here. There were no large-scale rebellions going on against Roman rule, so there's no real excuse for the Romans to come and raze the farm to the ground. Life would probably be quite peaceful and quiet, perhaps even more so than 600 years ago, with the Romans keeping law and order. So what about the other hand? What if I managed to somehow integrate into Roman society? That would be a whole different ballgame. I'd have access to civilization, towns with gymnasiums, bathhouses, and all sorts of amenities. There'd be far more career opportunities, more freedom to move around the empire and travel. Now of course the Romans didn't just hand out citizenship to anyone who asked for it. I'd likely have to render a few years of service to earn that status. But if I did manage it, I'd unlock privileges that I didn't have as a local. I could potentially travel anywhere throughout the empire, and be part of something bigger. Of course there is another way, which might be a bit of a happy medium. Of course the Romans did employ locals in local industries. I could certainly still be of some use to them, with my skills as a potter, and stay living locally, while adopting some Roman practices. I was doing okay as a potter back in the countryside in 500 BC. Production was quite small scale, what I was making was quite basic, but it got me along. I had goods to trade, I was helping the local community, and I was doing my part. What would it be like now, if I were to do this for the Romans? We certainly have an abundance of archaeological evidence that pottery production was alive and thriving in Roman Staffordshire, on a much more industrial scale. The Romans have introduced more advanced technologies, much better kilns, vertical ones instead of the crude pits that I was using before, pedal-powered potter's wheels, which means I could work much faster, and also a focused factory-like setting, with a dedicated industrial centre, rather than just a workshop within the village. Would I be making some fancy Roman glazed pottery? Probably not. That stuff was the height of fashion, and there is evidence for it in the UK, but most of it was probably imported and made on the continent. We just didn't have the practical ingredients to make it here, although I'm sure many locals did try. Another bit of big business would be tiles. We would have to make lots and lots of those. Not just for decoration, but they were absolutely essential for Roman infrastructure. They were used in army barracks, bathhouses, aqueducts. All of this stuff needed tiles, and they were genuinely in demand. and we certainly do have lots of evidence of these being produced locally, the clay being very suited for it. As I mentioned, my setting would be more industrial-like. I'd be working in an actual workshop, and it's probably going to be more commercial and a lot more organised, so it'd certainly be more familiar to me from the 21st century than it would be from 500 BC. We'd also be using techniques that I recognise sub-modern times, things like moulds, presses, which just didn't exist 600 years ago. The other nice bit, I'd actually be getting paid in proper money for my work. In the world of 500 BC, I was literally just making stuff to trade or use locally. Here I'm following a pattern which probably resembles 20th century piecework, and getting paid for my productivity. So in many ways things came full circle nearly 2,000 years later. Another fun and familiar activity from modern Stoke-on-Trent that I'm going to find here is backstamping. Not as painful as it sounds. Modern pots are marked with a stamp on the back so that you know who made them and when. The Romans were certainly doing this nearly 2,000 years ago. It's quite a nice thought that in the 20th or 21st centuries, some archaeologists might dig up one of my pots, turn it over, as our Stokies are just hardwired to do, and see my backstamp, and I'm going to leave an enduring legacy, along with many others from this time. Maybe I'll even end up on display in the Potteries Museum, you never know. There's another avenue that's available to me as well. I could join the Roman army as an auxiliary. If I did, there's a decent chance I'd be sent somewhere more exotic. That was standard practice for the Romans. They'd move soldiers around to avoid the complications of divided loyalties amongst the locals. I probably wouldn't earn full citizenship that way, at least not unless I served for a long time, but I could have a chance of a life outside of North Staffordshire. Whether that's an exciting adventure, or a chance of a grisly death somewhere else, depends on luck, I suppose, but the idea of being a genuine Roman soldier is quite cool. This feels somewhat like a redundant question, but if we did have the chance to travel in this time, is there anything to see? Of course there is, absolutely loads. This is one of the most flourishing civilizations in history. Even locally there are places I'd like to see. Places I've actually been in the 21st century, and it'd be absolutely fantastic to see Viriconium, what is now Wroxeter, before it became an English heritage managed ruin. The real thing would be incredibly impressive. It'd also be nice to see if Litocetum really looked like the drawings that are found on the English heritage site as well. That site is now found just outside Lichfield in a village called Wall. Of course, another impressive site I'd love to see in Britain, a bit further north, is Hadrian's Wall, one of the great construction marvels of the era, and it would have been complete by 130 AD, having been completed a few years earlier. We might even see some finishing touches being added, which would be an incredible sight. If we join the auxiliaries, we might even end up stationed there, you never know. Of course, Bath is another place down south. The Roman baths there are pretty impressive even in modern times, so it must have been absolutely stunning in its heyday. Of course, the real dream would be to go to Rome itself, the capital. If I could swing it, that would be an incredible opportunity. Just to see all of the buildings and ruins that I saw on my trip in the 21st century, alive and well and in their prime, would be fantastic. Of course, I'll probably have to move quickly if I want to do all this stuff, because I've got a feeling this time-travelling thing is just not going to stop, and I have absolutely no idea how long I have here in Roman Britain. But while I'm here, and I'm making the most of it, it's not bad really. I've got options, I've got opportunities, and I've got the chance to actually see some incredible sights. What if this happened to you? What if you got stuck in Roman Britain? Is there anywhere specifically in the Roman world you'd like to visit? Anyone from this time that you'd like to meet? I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to watch the previous episode where I was living in 500 BC. And if I do end up time travelling again, which, let's be honest, seems pretty likely at this point, I'll be sure to let you know where I end up so you can come along with me. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video. There's lots more to discover about the Potteries dialect and the history and culture of North Staffordshire. Take care folks, and I'll see you again next time.